An emotional story of redemption, love, passion, and new beginnings. He traveled with the plane assistant, but never expected to be consumed with jealousy, seeing her by the pool with someone else. What seemed like just work turned into a war between guilt, desire, and a secret buried for years. And when the truth came to light, loving her became the greatest risk of his life. Thomas Miller always had one golden rule: never get involved with anyone from work. Not out of coldness, but pure survival. A mistake made early in his career had nearly destroyed his reputation, and since then he had become a man who observed, controlled, and avoided. At 45, he led one of the country's most solid technology companies, with the same rigor with which he locked away his own feelings. His world consisted of unchanging routines, well-crafted contracts, and elegant silences. Tech Vision occupied 3 entire floors of a commercial building in downtown Boston. It was a modern, clean environment, with those glass walls that made everything visible but not necessarily transparent. Thomas knew each employee by name, knew who was going through personal difficulties, who had small children, who dreamed of promotion. But knowing didn't mean getting involved. He was a respected leader precisely because he maintained that respectful distance, that cold elegance that inspired confidence without creating intimacy. He always arrived at 7 in the morning, an hour before the official workday began. He enjoyed the silence of the empty office, the coffee still hot in the Italian machine that he operated himself, the first rays of sun passing through the tinted glass. It was during this time that he planned his day, reviewed contracts, responded to international emails. It was his ritual of control, his way of ensuring that nothing caught him unprepared. That Monday in March, the day before the executive retreat at Eagle Valley, Thomas was reviewing the list of participants when Martha, his executive assistant for more than 10 years, knocked on the glass door of his office. "Thomas, we have a problem." Her voice carried that controlled urgency he knew well. Martha was a woman in her early 50s, efficient as a Swiss watch, and possessing an impressive ability to resolve crises without alarm. "What happened?" "Sandra had a domestic accident last night, broke her wrist and needs surgery. She can't travel." Thomas sighed. Sandra was the project manager who was supposed to accompany him to the retreat, an experienced professional who knew all the details of the presentations he would make over the next 4 days. She was someone he trusted, someone predictable. "Who do you suggest as a replacement?" "Well, I analyzed the available profiles. Most of the senior team already has commitments scheduled for this week. But there's Sarah Bennett from the projects department. She knows the material well, participated in the preparation of several presentations and—" "Bennett?" Thomas frowned. The surname sounded familiar, but he couldn't place from where. "Yes, Sarah. She's worked here for almost 2 years. Very efficient, discreet. In fact, you might not have even noticed her. She's quite, how can I say, reserved." "Reserved." Thomas almost smiled. In the corporate world, reserved was code for invisible. He nodded. "That's fine. Confirm with her and send me the updated resume. We leave tomorrow at 6 in the morning." Martha left, and Thomas returned to the contracts. But something bothered him. Bennett. Why did that surname stir something in him? He shook his head, dismissing the feeling. It was 4 days of work, panels about technological innovation, dinners with investors, and a final presentation about the company's direction. Nothing an efficient assistant couldn't handle. The next morning, Thomas was waiting in the building lobby when a taxi stopped in front. Out stepped a woman whom he took a few seconds to recognize. Sarah Bennett. He had seen her in the hallways, of course, but always in passing, always hurried, always somewhat hidden behind folders and reports. Now, she was there, with a discreet suitcase, sober clothes, brown hair tied in a practical bun, glasses that framed a common face. Nothing that would catch attention, nothing that would disturb. "Good morning, Mr. Miller. Thank you for the opportunity." Her voice was low, polite, without flourishes. "Good morning, Sarah, shall we?" The journey to Eagle Valley Lodge took just over an hour. Thomas drove his BMW in silence, occasionally consulting the GPS. Sarah was in the passenger seat reviewing documents, making notes in a small, neat handwriting. Now and then, he observed her from the corner of his eye. There was something about her he couldn't define. It wasn't beauty, it wasn't charm. It was a kind of silent density, as if she carried stories she would never tell. "Have you been to Eagle Valley before?" he asked, more to break the silence than out of real interest. "No, sir, but I've read about the place. It's a historic lodge, right? From the 19th century." "Yes. Old mansion, gardens, suitable environment for long meetings without urban distractions." She nodded and returned to her papers. Thomas noticed that she didn't ask unnecessary questions, didn't try to make conversation, didn't show nervousness about traveling with the CEO of the company. She was professional, contained, almost absent. Exactly the type of company he preferred for business trips. Eagle Valley appeared after a winding road that climbed the mountain. It was truly impressive, a white colonial mansion with spacious verandas surrounded by gardens that seemed straight out of a period film. The pool was in a more secluded area, surrounded by old trees that created an almost mystical atmosphere. There was something melancholic about the place, as if the stones held memories from other times. "Beautiful," murmured Sarah, and for the first time since they had gotten into the car, her voice carried genuine emotion. Thomas observed her. She was standing on the main veranda, looking at the gardens with an expression he couldn't interpret. It wasn't tourist admiration. It was something deeper, more personal, as if she already knew that place or as if that place knew her. The other executives had already arrived. There was a team of 12 people, including directors, senior managers, and some external consultants. Thomas greeted everyone, made the customary introductions, explained the agenda for the coming days. Sarah remained discreet, taking notes on everything, organizing materials, almost invisible among the older and more experienced executives. The first day passed without incident. Morning meetings, working lunch, more meetings in the afternoon. Sarah proved to be exactly what Martha had promised. Efficient, discreet, always one step ahead of his needs. She anticipated when he would need a document, served coffee at the right temperature, took precise notes during presentations. It was like having a competent shadow. In the evening, Thomas dined with the closest directors in a private room at the lodge. They talked about the company's direction, about new projects, about increasingly aggressive competition in the technology market. It was a conversation he could have had in any Boston restaurant, but the historic setting of the lodge gave a solemn touch to the meeting. After dinner, he walked through the gardens. He liked these moments of solitude when he could process the day's information, plan strategies for the next day. The night was clear, with an almost full moon that silvered the leaves of the century-old trees. It was beautiful, but it didn't move him. Beauty, for Thomas, was something to be appreciated with the mind, not the heart. The second day began like the first, but something changed during the afternoon. Thomas was presenting the numbers from the last quarter when he noticed that Sarah wasn't taking notes. She was looking out the window with a distant expression, almost melancholic. When he finished the presentation, she took a few seconds to return to the present. "Sorry," she said quietly. "I got distracted." It was the first time she had shown any flaw, any human fragility. Thomas almost smiled. Even competent shadows had moments of distraction. That night, there was the formal board dinner. It was a tradition at the retreats, an elegant meal with executives in formal attire to celebrate partnerships and discuss the company's next steps in a more relaxed environment. Thomas wore a dark suit, silk tie, Italian shoes that gleamed under the colonial chandelier of the main hall. He arrived at dinner promptly at 8 o'clock. The table was set with fine china, crystal glasses, candles that created an intimate and elegant atmosphere. The executives were already gathered, talking in small groups, with glasses of wine in hand. Thomas greeted everyone, accepted a glass of an exceptional Bordeaux, and positioned himself at one end of the table, from where he could observe the entire hall. That's when she appeared. Sarah entered the hall, and Thomas had to blink twice to make sure it was really her. The brown hair was loose, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She wore a simple black dress, not too low-cut, without sparkles, but which followed the curves of her body with almost architectural precision. The lipstick was discreet, the color of ripe plum. The glasses had disappeared, revealing brown eyes that seemed larger, more expressive, more alive. It was still the same woman, obviously, but it was as if a hidden version of her had been revealed. It wasn't that she had suddenly become beautiful. It was that he was seeing her for the first time, really seeing. Sarah approached the table with the same discretion as always, politely greeted the executives, and took her place in a side chair. Thomas noticed that her hands trembled slightly when she picked up the wine glass. Was it nervousness or something else? Dinner began with a gravlax salmon appetizer. Parallel conversations were established along the table: business, family, politics, sports. Thomas participated mechanically, but his attention was divided. Without meaning to, his eyes always returned to Sarah. The way she held the glass, how she tilted her head to listen to conversations, how she smiled discreetly when someone made a joke. That's when Gabriel Laurent arrived. Gabriel was a newly hired French consultant for the company, a specialist in digital innovation. He was in his early 30s, brown hair with golden strands, an easy smile, and that natural charm of men who know they are attractive. Thomas had hired him for his technical competence, but now, seeing him approach the table with the confidence of someone who wins hearts without effort, he felt a touch of irritation. "Pardon, je suis un peu en retard," said Gabriel, occupying the only empty chair, which was exactly next to Sarah. "Pas de problème," replied Sarah, and the fluency with which she spoke French caught Thomas completely off guard. Gabriel smiled, delighted. "Ah, you speak French. How wonderful. It's so rare to find Americans who—" "I lived in Lyon for 2 years," explained Sarah, and for the first time since Thomas had known her, her voice carried warmth, spontaneity. "I did my master's in cultural management." Cultural management. Thomas didn't know that. In fact, he realized that he knew almost nothing about Sarah. Not her complete resume, not her background, not her personal history. She was just a competent shadow who organized his schedule and took precise notes. During the main course, a rack of lamb with herbs from the lodge's own garden, Gabriel and Sarah conversed in French. He told funny stories about his adaptation to America. She laughed naturally, lightly touched his arm when she wanted to emphasize a point. It was a social dance that Thomas knew well, but that he had never seen Sarah perform. The sound of her laughter hit him like a punch to the stomach. It was crystalline, genuine, completely different from the polite smiles she distributed at the office. It was a laugh that didn't belong to him, that wasn't directed at him, that revealed a facet of her that he hadn't even imagined existed. Jealousy. The word appeared in Thomas's mind with the force of a revelation. That's what he was feeling. Irrational, fulminant jealousy of that charming Frenchman who, in 1 hour of conversation, had discovered more about Sarah than he had in 2 years of professional coexistence. Jealousy of a woman he barely knew, who until 3 days ago was practically invisible to him, who wasn't available in his effective market, because she was an employee of the company and therefore forbidden territory. Jealousy that made no sense, but that burned in his chest like acid. Thomas tried to focus on the conversation happening on his side of the table, something about investments in startups, but his ears involuntarily caught fragments of the conversation in French. Gabriel was telling about the vineyards of Burgundy. Sarah was commenting on a trip she had taken to the Loire. They seemed like old friends, or better. They seemed like two people who could become something more than friends without much effort. When dessert arrived, a petit gâteau with lavender ice cream, Thomas could no longer pretend interest in the conversation around him. Each laugh from Sarah, each witty comment from Gabriel, each exchange of glances between them was like an insect bite, small but persistent and growing. "Thomas, are you okay?" asked Robert, the financial director, noticing his distraction. "Perfectly. Just thinking about tomorrow's presentations." Lie. He was thinking about how it would feel to pull Gabriel out of that chair and send him back to France on the first available flight. He was thinking about how a discreet assistant had managed to turn his world upside down in a matter of hours, just by swapping glasses for contact lenses and letting her hair down. He was thinking that his golden rule had just been challenged in the most unexpected way possible. At 10:30, the formal dinner came to an end. The executives said goodbye politely. Some headed to the lodge's bar. Others went straight to their rooms. Thomas rose from the table without ceremony, greeted those he needed to greet, and left the hall without saying goodbye to Sarah or Gabriel. He needed air. He needed silence. He needed to understand what the hell was happening to him. He walked through the lodge's gardens, breathing deeply the fresh mountain air. The moon was even brighter than the night before, creating dramatic shadows between the trees. The scent of night jasmine floated in the air, mixed with the smell of damp earth and ancient leaves. That's when he saw her. Sarah was sitting by the edge of the pool, her feet dipped in the water. the dark dress clinging to her body from the night dew. She had taken off her shoes and left them aside, in an image that had something deeply melancholic about it. She wasn't looking at the water, but at the mansion, as if studying each window, each detail of the colonial architecture. Thomas stopped where he was. He could go back to his room, pretend he hadn't seen her, maintain the safe distance he always maintained, or he could approach, break the golden rule, admit that something had changed between them, even if that something didn't have a name yet. He chose to approach. His steps on the grass made an almost imperceptible noise, but she sensed his presence. She didn't turn, didn't move. She just said, with an almost cruel serenity, "You're not used to being ignored, are you?" The phrase hit him with surgical precision. It was true. He was used to being the center of attention, the man whose words carried weight, whose decisions changed courses. He had spent the entire dinner being irrelevant in a conversation that was happening beside him, in a language he didn't master, between two people who seemed to understand each other without effort. "May I sit?" he asked. She made a vague gesture with her hand, which he interpreted as a yes. Thomas took off his shoes and socks, rolled up his suit pants and sat down beside her, dipping his feet into the warm water of the pool. They remained like this for a few minutes in silence, observing the reflection of the moon trembling on the water's surface. An almost physical tension enveloped them. It wasn't just sexual desire, although that was also present. It was an emotional collision, as if two tectonic plates had met and produced a silent seismic shock. "You speak French fluently," Thomas said finally. "You didn't know." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Sarah was forcing him to admit that he knew nothing about her beyond her professional efficiency. "No, I didn't know. There's a lot you don't know about the people who work with you." The criticism was gentle but accurate. Thomas prided himself on knowing his employees, but he realized that he knew only the professional versions of them. He knew that Robert had 2 children and an ex-wife, but he didn't know that Sarah had lived in France. He knew that Martha liked plants and had 3 cats, but he didn't know that the woman sitting next to him spoke French, as if she had been born in Paris. "You're right," he admitted. "Perhaps I've gotten used to seeing only what I need to see." Sarah finally turned to look at him. Her eyes were serious, almost sad. "And what do you see when you look at me?" The question was direct, intimate, dangerous. Thomas could give a safe, professional answer. He could say that he saw a competent employee, an efficient assistant, a discreet professional. But those words were no longer true, not after that night. "I see someone I would like to get to know better," he said, and the words came out more honest than he intended. Sarah smiled, but it was a sad smile. "Be careful, Thomas. Some people carry stories that you might not want to know." There was something dark in that phrase, something that suggested secrets, old pains, emotional territories that she protected with silence and discretion. Thomas felt that he was at a crossroads. He could retreat, return to the safety of professional distance, keep his golden rule intact. Or he could advance, enter unknown territory, discover what was behind the woman who had spent 2 years being invisible to him. "Maybe I'm willing to take that risk," he said. Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if she were evaluating the sincerity of his words. "Then you're braver than you seem." She stood up, dried her feet on the grass, put on her shoes. Before leaving, she looked at him one last time. "Good night, Thomas. Tomorrow we go back to being just boss and employee." But in the way she said it, there was an implicit promise that nothing would be as before, that the invisible woman had been seen, that the controlled man had been destabilized, that something had begun there by the edge of that pool, under the light of a moon that seemed complicit in secrets that were yet to be revealed. Thomas stayed there for another hour, his feet in the warm water, his brain boiling. For the first time in years, he couldn't plan the next day. He couldn't foresee the movements, control the variables, keep everything under his elegant and cold domain. Sarah Bennett had entered his life as a last-minute substitute, but was leaving it as a revelation that he didn't know if he wanted or feared. One thing, however, was certain. His golden rule would never be the same again. Chapter 2. Thomas woke up before the alarm, as usual. But that morning, for the first time in years, he couldn't immediately remember where he was. The bed was different, the smell of the air was different, and there was a strange feeling in his chest as if something fundamental had changed during the night. Then he remembered Eagle Valley, the executive retreat, Sarah by the pool, her feet in the water, that phrase that still echoed in his mind. "You're not used to being ignored, are you?" He got up and went to the window of the room. The morning sun gilded the gardens of the lodge, creating long shadows between the century-old trees. Down below he could see some of the executives walking through the gardens, already dressed for breakfast. Everything seemed normal, routine, predictable, but Thomas knew that something had irreversibly changed the night before. He showered, shaved with his usual care, wore a light blue dress shirt and beige linen pants. In the mirror he saw the same man as always. Perfectly combed greying hair, dark eyes that inspired confidence, erect posture that conveyed natural authority. But inside, he felt like a teenager who had discovered that he could fall in love. Breakfast was served on a spacious veranda overlooking the gardens. Full table, fresh bread, seasonal fruits, coffee that perfumed the entire environment. Thomas arrived promptly at 7 o'clock, as always. Some executives were already there, talking about the morning news, the international markets, the day's schedule. Sarah wasn't there. Thomas served himself coffee, took some fruit, sat at one end of the table from where he could observe the entire veranda. He participated in the routine conversations, answered questions about the day's agenda, but his eyes constantly returned to the veranda entrance, expecting to see her appear. 7:15, 7:20, 7:30. "Has anyone seen Sarah?" he asked, trying to sound casual. "She went out early for a walk," replied Gabriel, the French consultant. "I met her in the gardens about 20 minutes ago. She said she needed fresh air to think." "Think about what?" Thomas wanted to ask, but restrained himself. Gabriel continued eating his toast with jam as if nothing had happened, but there was something in his tone of voice that suggested intimacy, as if he and Sarah had arranged that morning meeting. The irritation returned to burn in Thomas's chest. It was irrational, he knew. Sarah had every right to walk in the gardens with whomever she wanted, to talk with whomever she wanted, to smile at whomever she wanted. But reason doesn't always govern the heart, and Thomas's heart was clearly out of his control. At 8 o'clock, the first meeting of the day began. It was a session on technological innovation, with presentations from different departments on projects under development. Thomas coordinated the work, asked questions, offered suggestions, but part of his attention was divided. Sarah arrived 15 minutes late. She entered the meeting room discreetly, apologized with a silent nod of her head, and occupied a chair at the back of the room. She was wearing a simple white blouse, dark midi skirt, hair tied in a low ponytail. Nothing special, nothing that called attention, but Thomas noticed that her cheeks were rosy from exercise, that there was a brightness in her eyes that wasn't there the day before. She opened her laptop, took a pen, assumed her position as an efficient and invisible assistant. But there was something different in her behavior, a contained energy, a subtle vivacity that contrasted with the discretion of previous days. During a break between presentations, Thomas approached her. "Everything okay? You arrived a little late." "Sorry. I woke up early, decided to walk a bit. Lost track of time. Gabriel said he met you." Why had he said that? It was as if he were demanding explanations, as if he had some right over her movements. Sarah looked at him with an expression he couldn't interpret. He was returning from his morning run. "We talked for a few minutes." "About what?" Now she smiled, but it was a smile that carried irony. "About Lion. About the difference between French gardens and American gardens. About how he's adapting to the country." She paused. "Why the curiosity?" Thomas felt his face heat up. It was a fair question. Why the curiosity? Why that need to know who she was talking to, what she was talking about? Why she smiled that way when she was with Gabriel? "I just want to make sure you're comfortable. After all, you're here representing the company." It was a diplomatic lie, and they both knew it. Sarah tilted her head, studying him carefully. "I'm very comfortable, thank you. I can assure you I won't do anything that compromises TechVision's reputation." There was something sharp in those words, a subtle provocation that left Thomas uncomfortable. It was as if she were testing how far he was willing to take that conversation, how far he was willing to admit that his interest in her went far beyond professional concern. The meeting resumed, and Thomas tried to focus on the presentations, but his eyes constantly returned to Sarah. The way she took notes, how she tilted her head when she was thinking, how she slightly bit her lower lip when she was concentrating, small gestures that he had never noticed before and that now seemed loaded with meaning. During lunch, served on a terrace overlooking the mountains, Thomas observed the social interactions of the group. Gabriel was being the center of attention, telling amusing stories about cultural differences between America and France. Everyone laughed, including Sarah, who was sitting 2 chairs to the right of him. But there were moments when she would get distracted, look at the mountains with that melancholic expression he had noticed the day before. It was as if her mind were elsewhere, another time processing memories or concerns that she didn't share with anyone. "Sarah, did you know this region before?" asked Robert, the financial director. "Not exactly, but my family has had connections with the Pennsylvania mountains. My brother loved these mountains." There was something painful in the way she said "had." Thomas realized that it was the first time she had mentioned family, brother, anything personal, and she had gone from the present to the past in a way that suggested loss. "Oh, your brother doesn't live in the region anymore," insisted Robert, with the natural curiosity of someone who likes to get to know people. "My brother died a few years ago." The silence that followed was heavy, awkward. Robert murmured an apology, others expressed belated condolences. Sarah accepted the condolences politely, but it was evident that she preferred not to go into details. Thomas felt something move in his chest. It wasn't just curiosity now. It was a genuine desire to comfort her, to understand what pain she carried, what story was behind that melancholy that sometimes took over her gaze. The conversation changed subject, but he continued observing her. There was a new vulnerability in her posture, as if the mention of the brother had opened a wound that she tried to keep closed. Gabriel, perceptive, offered her a glass of water, asked if she was okay. She thanked him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. The afternoon passed with more meetings, more presentations. Thomas conducted a session on strategic planning, talked about market challenges, growth opportunities. His performance was impeccable, as always, but part of his mind was focused on Sarah, on the pain that had shone in her eyes when she mentioned her dead brother. At 6 in the evening, the official activities of the day ended. The executives spread out around the lodge. Some went to the bar, others to their rooms. Some decided to explore the gardens before dinner. Thomas saw Sarah storing her materials, closing her laptop, organizing the folders with her usual efficiency. "Sarah," she looked at him. "Can we talk in private?" She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Sure." They left the meeting room and walked in silence through the corridors of the lodge. Thomas led her to a small library he had discovered the previous afternoon. It was a cozy environment, with dark wood shelves filled with old books, worn leather armchairs, an unlit fireplace that gave a touch of nostalgia to the environment. Sarah sat in one of the armchairs, hands crossed in her lap, posture erect but not tense. Thomas occupied the chair next to her, turned towards her. "I want to apologize if Robert's question was invasive. About your brother. You have nothing to apologize for. It wasn't invasive, it was human. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. But if you want to, I'd like to listen." Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if she were deciding if she could trust him, if he deserved to know a true part of her story. "Ethan was 8 years older than me. When our parents died in a car accident, I was 15, and he took my guardianship. He was a computer genius, you know, one of those who see the world in codes and algorithms, but he was also generous, funny, protective. Ethan." The name resonated in Thomas's mind like a distant echo. Why did that name sound familiar to him? He worked with technology? Yes, in fact, he came to found a company. Very small, but with innovative projects. He dreamed of revolutionizing the way people communicated through technology. Her voice got lower, sadder. He died in a car accident too, like our parents. Sometimes I have the impression that my family was destined to die on roads. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. There was something in that story that touched him deeply. Perhaps because he himself had lost his parents early. Perhaps because he recognized in her voice the same kind of pain he carried. "I'm sorry, Sarah. It must have been very difficult." It was. Especially because... She stopped as if she were deciding whether to continue. "What?" "Because I never managed to fully understand what happened. Ethan was a careful driver. He knew that road like the back of his hand, And there were issues in his company, problems he was trying to solve before the accident. There was something dark in those words. Thomas felt that she was giving him clues to something bigger, more complex, but he didn't know how to interpret these clues. What kind of problems? Sarah looked him in the eyes, and for the first time since they had met, he saw an almost dangerous intensity in her gaze. Problems with partners, ethical issues. Ethan discovered that he was being used, that his ideas were being stolen, that people he trusted were betraying that trust. She paused. He died 2 weeks after discovering this. The air in the library seemed to get heavier. Thomas felt that there were layers in that story that she wasn't revealing, secrets that she carefully protected. But he also felt that she was testing him, offering him pieces of the truth to see how he would react. Do you suspect that the accident wasn't accidental? I suspect that my brother died with a broken heart. Whether that was enough to make him lose concentration on the road. She shrugged. I'll never know. They were silent for a few minutes. Thomas processed the information, tried to understand why that story bothered him so much. There was something familiar there, something that stirred memories that he preferred to keep buried. How did you end up at TechVision? He asked. For the first time, Sarah smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Ah, that's an interesting story. After Ethan died, I decided I wanted to understand the world of technology. I wanted to know how this universe that he loved so much worked. I studied, specialized, worked in some smaller companies. When I found out that TechVision was hiring, I applied. Why specifically TechVision? The question came out more direct than he intended. Sarah looked at him carefully, as if she were measuring each word before speaking. Because you have a solid reputation, because you're ethical, because... She made a significant pause. Because sometimes you need to be close to the things you want to understand. There was something in that phrase that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand on end. It was as if she were giving him coded information, a message that he should decipher but couldn't. Sarah, can I ask you a direct question? You can. Are you at TechVision for any specific reason? Beyond work? She studied him for a long moment, as if she were deciding how much she could reveal. Everyone has specific reasons for being where they are, Thomas. Sometimes these reasons are obvious. Sometimes they are more complex. It was a non-answer, but it was also a confirmation. There was something more behind her presence in the company, something that she wasn't willing to reveal yet. The lodge bell rang 7 times. Time for dinner. We should go, said Sarah, standing up. Thomas stood up too, but when she passed by him, he gently held her arm. Sarah, she stopped, looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. Thank you for trusting me, for telling me about your brother. I didn't tell everything, she said softly. I know. And you? Will you tell me your secrets? The question caught him off guard. It was fair. He had asked her to open up, to share painful parts of her story. It was natural that she would expect reciprocity. I'm not sure if you would like to know them. Try me. Thomas took a deep breath. There were secrets he had never told anyone, decisions he had made at the beginning of his career, compromises he had made to get where he was. When I started at TechVision 15 years ago, I wasn't the upright man I am today. I made questionable choices. To protect the company, to protect important people, to protect my own career, things that at the time seemed necessary but that today bother you, haunt me. Sarah looked at him with an intensity that completely disarmed him. What kind of choices? I signed documents. I agreed to silences. I closed my eyes to things I should have questioned. He paused. I let people be harmed because it was easier than fighting. People like who? The question came loaded with a tension he didn't expect. It was as if she already knew the answer, as if she were testing if he would be honest. Minor partners, inventors, people who trusted the company and were betrayed by that trust. The silence that followed was tense, electric. Sarah looked at him as if she were seeing him for the first time, as if every word he said was being judged by criteria he didn't know. And do you regret it? Every day. Regret is easy, Thomas. What would you do if you had the chance to fix those things? It was a question loaded with implications. Thomas felt that there were layers in that conversation that he wasn't capturing, that Sarah was leading him somewhere he couldn't foresee. I would do whatever was necessary, even if it cost my career. Sarah nodded slowly, as if he had passed a test. Interesting. They left the library in silence and walked through the corridors of the lodge towards the dining hall. But now there was a different tension between them. It wasn't just sexual attraction or romantic curiosity. It was something deeper, more dangerous. As if both held secrets that could destroy everything they knew. Dinner was simpler than the day before, without the formality of social clothes. A relaxed meeting on the terrace overlooking the mountains that were silhouetted against the starry sky. Conversations about future projects, expansion strategies, market trends. Thomas participated mechanically, but his attention was divided between the professional discussions and the observation of Sarah. She was quieter than the day before, more thoughtful. Gabriel tried to make conversation a few times, but she responded politely, without the warmth of the previous day. During dessert, Robert made a joke about couples that formed in corporate retreats. Did you see that story in the business magazine? The CEO of a startup who fell in love with the marketing director during a retreat in Hawaii? They got married 6 months later. Ah, but that's risky, said Gabriel. Relationships at work always complicate things. Depending on the people involved, commented one of the directors. If they're mature, professional, or if they're able to separate personal life and professional life, added another executive. Thomas noticed that Sarah was paying attention to the conversation, but without participating. There was something tense in her posture, as if the subject bothered her. And you, Thomas, provoked Robert, have you ever fallen in love with a colleague? The question was asked in a joking tone, but Thomas felt all eyes turn to him, including Sarah's. I have a golden rule, he said, trying to keep the tone light. Work is work. Rules are made to be broken, laughed Gabriel. Not mine. But even as he said this, Thomas knew he was lying. His golden rule had already been broken, shattered, destroyed, and the responsible was sitting 3 meters from him, pretending not to pay attention to the conversation. Dinner ended around 10 o'clock. The executives dispersed. Some went to the bar, others to their rooms. Thomas said goodbye to everyone and walked through the gardens, needing fresh air to think. The night was clear, but there were clouds forming on the horizon, suggesting rain for the coming hours. The scent of jasmine was more intense than on previous nights, mixed with the smell of damp earth and leaves that announced a storm. He didn't expect to find her again, but there was Sarah, sitting on a stone bench in the middle of the garden, looking at the mansion as if she were memorizing every detail of the colonial architecture. You like old places, said Thomas, approaching. I like places that hold stories. And what stories does this place hold? Sarah looked at him, and in the moonlight her eyes seemed laden with melancholy. Stories of love, of loss, of betrayal, like all old places. She paused. Like all people who live long enough. Thomas sat next to her on the stone bench. They were close enough for him to smell her perfume, something floral and discreet that matched her personality. Sarah, can I ask a question that might be invasive? You can. What stories do you hold? She smiled, but it was a sad smile. Many. Some that I've never told anyone. And some that you're deciding whether you should tell? Maybe. The first thunder echoed in the distance, still far away but promising intensity. Sarah looked at the sky. It's going to rain. Should we go inside? Not yet. They stayed there watching the clouds approach, feeling the wind that precedes the storm. There was something symbolic in that moment, as if the natural storm were a reflection of the emotional storm that was forming between them. Thomas. Yes? When you talked about your questionable choices, about having closed your eyes to things you should have questioned, were you referring to any specific situation? The question came loaded with an intensity he didn't expect. It was as if she already knew the answer, as if she were testing his honesty once again. Why do you ask? Because sometimes you need to understand the past to decide about the future. There was something prophetic in that phrase. Thomas felt that he was facing a decisive moment, one of those instances where a word can change the course of everything. Yes, he said finally. There was a specific situation. Can you tell me? Thomas took a deep breath. It was a story he had buried years ago, a story that involved documents signed under pressure, purchased silences, a life destroyed to protect larger interests. There was a minor partner in the company, a brilliant inventor who had revolutionary ideas, but he also had personal problems. Drank too much, was emotionally unstable. The main partners wanted to get rid of him, But they couldn't simply fire him because he owned part of the company. Sarah was absolutely still, as if each word were an expected revelation. And then they created a situation. They made it look like he was betraying the company, selling secrets to competitors. I was just a manager at the time, but they asked me to sign documents attesting that I had seen suspicious behaviors. And you signed? I signed, even knowing it was a lie. I wasn't sure if it was a lie. He really did drink, really was unstable. And they convinced me that it was for the good of the company, that it was necessary to protect the other employees, that it was necessary to protect your own career. The question was a direct hit. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of a guilt he had carried for years. Yes, it was also necessary to protect my career. And what happened to him? He lost everything. His part in the company, his reputation, his credibility. He was destroyed. And after that, Thomas opened his eyes and looked at Sarah. There was something terrible in her expression, a pain mixed with anger that he couldn't interpret. He died in a car accident, 2 weeks after losing everything. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind in the trees and the thunders that were approaching. Sarah was so still that she seemed to have stopped breathing. When she finally spoke, her voice was loaded with an emotion that he couldn't identify. What was his name? Thomas felt the blood freeze in his veins. There was something in the way she asked the question that awakened a primitive terror, a terrible suspicion that he didn't want to confirm. Why do you want to know? What was his name, Thomas? The repetition came with an authority that he couldn't resist. Ethan Bennett. The storm arrived at that exact moment. The first fat drops of rain began to fall, but neither Thomas nor Sarah moved. They looked at each other in the middle of the dark garden, under the trembling light of the lightning, like two people who had just discovered that they were on opposite sides of a war they didn't even know was being fought. "My brother," said Sarah, and her voice was a whisper that cut through the air like a blade. The rain began to fall with force, soaking them in seconds. But they remained there, motionless, processing the revelation that changed everything. Thomas had helped destroy the brother of the woman he was falling in love with, and she knew it, had known since the first day. Chapter 3. The rain fell with a violence that seemed to echo the emotional storm that had settled between them. Thomas and Sarah remained motionless in the garden for long seconds, soaked, processing the revelation that changed everything. The lightning illuminated their faces in dramatic flashes, revealing expressions of shock, pain, and something deeper that neither of them knew how to name. "My brother," repeated Sarah, and now her voice carried a raw old pain, but also an anger that had been carefully cultivated for years. Thomas felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. All the pieces fit now, the familiar surname, the way she observed him. The questions loaded with subtext, the way she had appeared at TechVision 2 years after Ethan's death. She wasn't just an efficient assistant who had developed feelings for him. She was the sister of the man whose life he had helped destroy. "Sarah," he began, but she interrupted him. "No." Her voice cut through the air like a razor. "Not now. Not here." She turned and walked quickly towards the lodge, her steps firm despite the rain that made the ground slippery. Thomas hesitated for a moment, then followed her. He couldn't let the conversation end like this, not after everything that had been revealed. Sarah entered through the side door of the lodge, which gave direct access to the upper floor. Her steps echoed down the ancient wooden corridor, leaving a trail of water on the floor. Thomas caught up with her when she was about to enter her own room. "Sarah, wait, we need to talk." She turned, and in the soft light of the corridor he saw that it wasn't just raindrops that were wetting her face. There were tears there, tears of anger and pain that she had kept for years. "Talk?" Her voice was low, but loaded with a dangerous intensity. "About what, Thomas? About how you helped kill my brother." "I didn't kill anyone. It was an accident. It was a consequence." The explosion came with a force that caught him off guard. "You destroyed his life. You took away everything he had, everything he believed in, everything he had worked for." Ethan left that office completely shattered, knowing that the people he trusted had betrayed him in the most cowardly way possible. Thomas felt each word like a punch to the stomach. He had carried the guilt for Ethan's death for years, but hearing the pain in Sarah's voice made everything much more real, much more devastating. "You're right," he said quietly. "You're absolutely right. I was a coward, I was selfish. I chose my career instead of doing what was right. And now? The question came loaded with challenge. Now that you're comfortably established in the company that was built on the ruins of my brother's life, how do you feel? Thomas had no answer for that. How does a man feel who discovers that he's falling in love with the sister of the person he helped destroy? How does someone feel who finally understands that his comfortable professional life was built on a betrayal? "May I come in?" he asked, indicating her room. Sarah hesitated, then opened the door more widely. It was a simple room, decorated in the colonial style of the lodge. She took a towel and began to dry her hair, the abrupt movements revealing her internal agitation. "Why did you come to work at TechVision?" asked Thomas. "Was it for revenge?" Sarah stopped drying her hair and looked at him with an expression that mixed surprise and something dangerously close to contempt. "Revenge?" She gave a bitter laugh. "You think I planned this for 2 years? That I plotted a plan to destroy your life as you destroyed Ethan's? I don't know what to think." "I came to understand." Her voice became lower, more controlled. "When Ethan died, I couldn't accept that I had lost the only family I had left because of corporate issues. I wanted to understand what kind of people were capable of doing what they did to him. And did you find out?" Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the towel in her hands. She seemed smaller now, more vulnerable, as if the anger had given way to a deep sadness. "I found out that most of you don't even remember him. Alexander Moore, who orchestrated everything, was promoted to vice president and today talks about corporate ethics in lectures. Victoria Sanders, who falsified the accounting documents, won an Executive of the Year award. And you," she looked him in the eyes, "you became CEO of a company that should have been partially his." The silence that followed was heavy, laden with guilt and pain. Thomas knew she was right. He knew that he had built his career on the ruins of Ethan Bennett's life, and that for years he had managed to convince himself that he had been just a pawn in a bigger game. "You're right," he said finally, "about everything. But there's something you need to know." "What?" "I didn't forget Ethan. I never forgot. I've carried the guilt of his death every day for 8 years. Sarah studied him carefully, as if she were trying to determine if he was being sincere. "Guilt doesn't bring back a life, Thomas." "No, but it can motivate changes." "What changes?" Thomas took a deep breath. It was time to reveal something he had never told anyone, not even himself out loud. 5 years ago, when I became CEO, I began to discreetly investigate what had happened to your brother. I wanted to understand if he had really been guilty of the accusations or if it had been a setup. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. "And what did you discover?" "That it had been a setup, complete. Ethan never sold information to competitors. In fact, he had discovered that other partners were doing this and was about to report them." The revelation hit Sarah like lightning. She remained absolutely still for several seconds, processing the implications of what he had said. "Do you have proof of this?" "Some, hidden in my personal safe. Documents, emails, recordings of meetings that I managed to recover from old archives. Why did you never do anything with these proofs?" Thomas lowered his head, ashamed. "Because doing something would mean admitting my participation in the farce. It would mean destroying my career, facing lawsuits, possibly going to jail, and because—" He paused. "Because there was no one to whom I could return justice. Ethan was dead. There was no known family. It seemed to me that causing a scandal would not bring benefit to anyone." "No known family." Sarah's voice was laden with bitter irony. "Of course. Because you didn't even bother to investigate if he had relatives. You simply erased him from history." "Sarah, if I had known you existed—" "What? What would you have done? Sought me out to apologize? Offered me money to buy my silence?" The anger was returning to her voice, but now mixed with something more complex. Thomas realized that there was pain there, but also an expectation, as if she wanted him to say the right words, to show that he was different from the other men who had betrayed her brother. "I would have done justice," he said with conviction. "I would have exposed everything, regardless of the consequences for me." Sarah studied him for a long moment, as if she were weighing all the possibilities, all the risks, all the consequences. "And now? Now that you know I exist, what are you going to do?" It was a question loaded with danger and possibilities. Thomas knew that he was facing a choice that would define not only his professional future, but who he was as a person. I'm going to expose everything. I'm going to make public all the evidence I have. I'm going to ensure that your brother's name is cleared, that the truth about what happened is known. Even knowing that this will destroy your career? Even knowing that. Why? The question was simple, but the answer was complex. Why was he willing to sacrifice everything he had built? Out of guilt? For justice? For love? Because it's what I should have done 8 years ago. And because... He hesitated, then decided to be completely honest. Because I fell in love with the sister of the man I helped destroy. And if there's any chance of deserving your forgiveness, I need to start by doing what's right. The silence that followed was different from the previous ones. It wasn't laden only with tension and pain, but also with something softer, more vulnerable. Sarah lowered her eyes, as if she were fighting with conflicting emotions. You can't fall in love with me, Thomas. It's already happened. You can't. Not after everything your group did to Ethan. Not after... After what? She looked at him, and now there were tears flowing freely down her face. After I spent 2 years planning how to destroy your life. The confession came low, almost whispering, but it hit Thomas with the force of a hurricane. What do you mean? Sarah got up and walked to the window. The rain had diminished, but still hit the glass in irregular gusts. When I discovered that you had become CEO of TechVision, I began to study your life. Your habits, your routines, your vulnerabilities. I got a job at the company with a partially falsified resume. I spent 2 years being invisible, collecting information, waiting for the right opportunity. Opportunity for what? To make you fall in love with me, and then destroy your life as you destroyed Ethan's. Thomas felt as if he had received a punch to the stomach. Everything made sense now. The way she had appeared at the retreat, how she had become indispensable, how she had managed to make him lower his guard. And is it working? He asked, with a bitterness that surprised them both. Sarah turned to him, and on her face was a confusion of emotions that he couldn't interpret. That's the problem, she said quietly. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be just revenge, but You what? I fell in love too. The confession came laden with pain, as if the words burned as they left her mouth. She leaned against the wall, as if she needed support to remain standing. It wasn't supposed to happen. It was supposed to be cold, calculated, but you're not what I expected. What did you expect? A monster. A cold, ambitious man without scruples. Someone I could hate without remorse. And what did you find? Sarah looked at him with an expression that mixed love and hate in equal proportions. I found a man laden with guilt. A man who remembers the name of each employee, who pays for the studies of the janitor's children, who anonymously donates to charities. I found someone who carries the weight of his own decisions and who, her voice failed, who looks at me as if I were the most precious thing in the world. The air in the room was charged with emotional electricity. They looked at each other like two people lost in a storm, not knowing whether they should embrace or move away. Sarah, don't say anything, she asked. Please. Don't make this more difficult than it already is. But Thomas approached her slowly, as if he were approaching a wounded animal. What do you want to do now? I don't know. The answer came laden with despair. I spent 2 years knowing exactly what I wanted. Now I don't know anything anymore. Do you know that you love me? She closed her eyes, as if the question caused physical pain. I know. And do you know that I love you? I know. Then let's start there. Thomas extended his hand to her. Sarah looked at the offered hand, as if it were a choice between salvation and condemnation. If I accept your hand, she said softly, I'll be betraying my brother's memory, or you'll be honoring it, making his death serve something greater than revenge. How so? Let's expose the truth together. Let's ensure that the real story is told. Let's make sure that the people responsible for his death pay for what they did. And after that? After that, we'll see if it's possible to build something good on the ruins of something terrible. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if she were weighing all the possibilities, all the risks, all the consequences. Finally, she extended her hand and touched his. The touch was electric, laden with all the tension, pain, and love that had accumulated between them. Thomas intertwined his fingers with hers, and for a moment They were just two people who loved each other, despite all the reasons not to love. "There's a safe in the library," said Sarah suddenly. "What?" "In the mansion, behind the shelves of old books. Ethan brought me here once when I was a teenager. The previous owner was a collector of historical documents. Ethan was fascinated with the opening mechanisms." Thomas frowned, not understanding where she wanted to go. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because before he died, Ethan told me that he had hidden copies of important documents in a safe place. He said that if anything happened to him, I should look for where books keep ancient secrets." The revelation hit Thomas like lightning. If Ethan had hidden documents about the betrayal he suffered, if there was concrete evidence of the setup, "Do you think he hid the documents here?" "I think it's worth investigating." They looked at each other, both understanding the implications. If they found the evidence that Ethan had hidden, they would have enough elements to expose not only the farce that led to his expulsion from the company, but possibly the entire network of corruption that was behind it. "The library must be locked at this hour," said Thomas. Sarah smiled, and it was the first genuine smile he had seen since the revelation. "You forget that I spent 2 years planning this. I learned some unconventional skills." 10 minutes later, they were walking through the dark corridors of the lodge towards the library. Thomas carried a small flashlight he had taken from the room. Sarah carried a set of tiny tools that he preferred not to ask how she had acquired. The library was plunged into darkness, with only the moonlight entering through the large windows. The dark wood shelves seemed even more imposing in the dark, like silent guardians of ancient secrets. "Where do we start?" whispered Thomas. Sarah examined the shelves carefully, running her hand over the woods, looking for irregularities. Ethan was always obsessed with mechanisms. If he hid something here, it wasn't in an obvious place. They spent 20 minutes examining every inch of the shelves, looking for secret drawers, movable panels, anything that could reveal a hiding place. It was Sarah who found it. "Here," she said quietly. She was kneeling in front of one of the lower shelves, examining a section dedicated to books on American history. There was a small bronze plaque with the date 1776 that seemed slightly misaligned in relation to the others. "Republic," murmured Sarah. "Ethan always said that the best secrets were hidden in moments of change." She pressed the plaque, and they heard a soft click. A section of the shelf moved slightly forward, revealing a small cavity behind the books. Thomas directed the flashlight to the opening. Inside was a yellowed envelope sealed with red wax. Sarah removed the envelope carefully, as if she were handling a precious relic. On the exterior, there was an inscription in Ethan's neat handwriting. "For Sarah. The truth always finds a way." "He knew," whispered Sarah, with tears in her eyes. "He knew that something could happen to him, and left this for me." She carefully broke the seal and removed several documents from the envelope. Thomas directed the flashlight so they could read. They were photocopies of internal TechVision emails, transcribed recordings of meetings, spreadsheets that showed irregular financial transfers. And at the center of it all, a detailed report that Ethan had prepared documenting how Alexander Moore and Victoria Sanders were selling confidential information to competitors and using him as a scapegoat. "My God," murmured Thomas, leafing through the documents. "He had everything. He had enough evidence to send them to jail. And that's why they killed him," said Sarah, with a conviction that froze Thomas's blood. "You think the accident—" "It was no accident. It never was." Her voice was laden with an old pain. "Ethan called me the night before his death. He said he had discovered something big, that he was going to report everything the next day. 12 hours later, he was dead on a road he knew like the back of his hand." Thomas felt the world spin around him. If Sarah was right, if Ethan had been murdered because of what he discovered, then the guilt he carried was much greater than he had imagined. He hadn't just helped destroy an innocent man's career, he had helped create the conditions that led to his murder. "Sarah, if this is true—" "It is true, and now we have the proof." She looked at him, and in the flashlight's light, her eyes shone with a determination that was both beautiful and frightening. "The question is, what are we going to do with it?" Thomas looked at the documents in his hands, then at the woman he loved, who had spent 2 years planning his destruction and who now held the key to exposing a conspiracy that had cost her brother's life. "We're going to do justice," he said finally, "no matter the price." Sarah nodded, and for the first time since they had met, they were completely aligned. No longer boss and employee, no longer victim and perpetrator, but partners in a search for truth that could destroy everything they knew. Outside, the storm was beginning to diminish, but inside the library, amid the old books and newly discovered secrets, a new storm was just beginning. A storm that would forever change the lives of all involved. Chapter 4. The last day of the retreat passed like a carefully rehearsed play. Thomas and Sarah performed their roles perfectly. He, the CEO, focused on business. She, the discreet and efficient assistant. But now there was an invisible electric current running between them, a silent conspiracy that no one else could perceive. During Thomas's final presentation on the company's direction, Sarah took notes as always, but her notes were different. They weren't about market strategies or financial projections. They were about names, dates, connections that linked the documents found in the library with the current structure of TechVision. Alexander Moore was in the front row, politely applauding the points presented by Thomas. At 58, he was a man of respectable appearance, well-cut graying hair, always impeccable suits. Vice President of Operations, he was considered by many as Thomas's right hand, a trusted man who knew every aspect of the company. Victoria Sanders, Financial Director, was 2 chairs to the right of Alexander. An elegant woman in her 40s, always dressed in the best that money could buy, owner of a smile that opened doors and closed deals. She had received 3 Executive of the Year awards in the last 5 years. Looking at them now, knowing what he knew, Thomas felt a growing nausea. They were murderers. Perhaps they hadn't pushed Ethan's car off the road with their own hands, but they had created the conditions that led to his death. And for 8 years, he had worked side by side with them, trusted them, built a company on the base of the lies they had created. "Any questions about the projections for the next quarter?" asked Thomas, concluding his presentation. Gabriel, the French consultant, raised his hand. "Yes, a question about innovation. Do you have plans to invest in smaller startups, support independent inventors?" The question hit Thomas like a precise arrow. It was exactly the kind of question that Ethan would ask, the kind of vision he had about the future of technology. "Certainly," replied Thomas, looking directly at Alexander and Victoria. "I believe that TechVision has the responsibility to support brilliant minds, no matter where they come from. We need to be a company that builds, not one that destroys." There was something in Alexander's eyes that changed slightly, an almost imperceptible tension, as if he had caught a subliminal message in Thomas's comment. 2 hours later, they were in the BMW returning to Boston. The landscape of the Pennsylvania mountains paraded past the windows, but neither of them paid attention to the natural beauty. There were practical issues to discuss, strategies to plan. "How are we going to do this?" asked Sarah, when they were far enough from the lodge to speak freely. "First, I need to copy the documents from my personal safe. Combine everything that Ethan left with what I've managed to gather in the last few years. Then we go to the police. Not to local officers who might be compromised, directly to the FBI, corporate corruption, possible homicide, money laundering. They'll have to investigate." Sarah nodded, but there was concern on her face. "Thomas, do you understand that from the moment we do this, there's no going back? Alexander and Victoria aren't just going to accept the exposure. They have a lot to lose." "What are you trying to say?" "I'm trying to say that they killed my brother to protect their secrets. What do you think they'll do to us?" The comment sent a chill down Thomas's spine. He had been so focused on the moral issue, on the need to do justice, that he hadn't fully considered the personal dangers involved. "So, you think we should give up?" "No." The answer came firm, decided. "I think we should be very, very careful." They arrived in Boston at the end of the afternoon on a Friday. The traffic was chaotic, as always, but there was something comforting in the familiarity of the city. Tall buildings, busy streets, the constant buzz of a metropolis that never slept. Thomas left Sarah at her apartment in Cambridge. It was a simple building, middle class, on a tree-lined street that contrasted with the luxury of his apartment in Beacon Hill. When she got out of the car, he held her hand for a moment. "Sarah." "Yes? What happened between us? Is it real? Or is it still part of your revenge plan?" The question had tormented him throughout the trip. Even after everything they had discovered, even after deciding to work together, he couldn't completely banish the doubt. Sarah leaned in and kissed him softly on the lips. It was a brief kiss, but laden with tenderness and promise. "It's real," she said softly. What I feel for you is the only real thing in this whole confusing story." She got out of the car and walked towards the building. Thomas stayed there for a few minutes, watching her disappear into the lobby, processing everything that had happened in the last 4 days. He had left for a routine executive retreat and was returning with his life completely transformed. On Saturday morning, Thomas was in his personal office. It was a space he had created in his apartment with a mahogany desk, shelves filled with business books, and a glass wall that offered a panoramic view of the city. Normally it was there that he planned strategies, reviewed contracts, prepared presentations. Today he was copying documents that could destroy his career. The personal safe was hidden behind a painting by Andrew Wyeth. Thomas typed in the combination and removed a thick folder, full of papers he had collected over the years. Emails recovered from old servers, recordings of meetings he had obtained through contacts in the IT area, financial documents that showed suspicious transfers. He was organizing everything in chronological order when the intercom rang. "Mr. Thomas." It was the doorman. "There's a Miss Sarah here downstairs. Says you're expecting her." He wasn't expecting her, but he wasn't surprised either. He had given her the address the night before, in case you need anything. "You can send her up." 10 minutes later, Sarah was in his office, examining the documents spread out on the mahogany desk. She wore jeans and a simple blouse, hair tied in a ponytail, but even dressed casually, there was a natural elegance about her that took his breath away. "Wow," she said, leafing through the papers. "You really did your homework. 5 years of discreet investigation. It wasn't easy to get all this without raising suspicions." Sarah picked up a specific document, a transcript of a meeting between Alexander and Victoria 6 months after Ethan's death. "Listen to this," she said, reading aloud. "The Bennett problem was definitively resolved. There's nothing more that can harm us." Definitively resolved? Who talks like that about a traffic accident? Thomas felt the anger grow in his chest. Even after everything he had discovered, it was still shocking to see how they referred to Ethan's death in such a casual, cold way. "There's more," he said, passing another document to her. "Victoria transferred $200,000 to an offshore account 3 days after your brother's death. The memo says it was payment for special services." Sarah went pale. They paid someone to kill him. It seems so. She sat heavily in an armchair, as if the weight of the confirmation was too much to bear standing up. "For 8 years, I suspected. For 8 years I lived with the pain of not being certain. And now we know. Now we know that my brother was murdered for $200,000. Thomas approached her and knelt beside the armchair, taking her hands in his. "We're going to make them pay, Sarah, I promise." She looked at him with eyes bright with contained tears. "How are we going to do that without ending up like Ethan?" It was a valid question, and Thomas didn't have an easy answer. "We're going to be smart. We're going to protect ourselves. And we're going to make sure that, if anything happens to us, the evidence reaches the authorities automatically." "How?" Thomas had already thought about this during the night. "I'm going to deliver copies of everything to 3 different people. My personal lawyer, an investigative journalist I know, and a contact at the FBI. I'll instruct them to open the envelopes if anything happens to me, or to you." Sarah nodded, but still seemed worried. "And at work? How are we going to act with Alexander and Victoria? Normally. We can't arouse suspicions. As long as they think we don't know anything, we're safe." They spent the rest of Saturday organizing the evidence, creating copies, preparing complete dossiers. It was meticulous work, which required attention to detail and perfect chronological organization. By the end of the afternoon, they had 4 complete sets of documents, each one sufficient to destroy Alexander and Victoria and expose the entire conspiracy that had led to Ethan's death. "Ready," said Thomas, sealing the last envelope. "On Monday, I'll deliver 3 of these to the people I've chosen. The 4th stays with me. And then? Then we wait. We observe. And when the right time comes, we attack. We attack." On Monday morning, Thomas arrived at the office earlier than usual. He wanted to have time to observe Alexander and Victoria, to see if there was any change in their behavior, any sign that they suspected something. Alexander arrived at 8 sharp as always. He greeted Thomas cordially, asked about the retreat, commented on the projects for the week. He was normal, relaxed, without any sign of tension or concern. Victoria appeared 20 minutes later, elegant as always, with a bright smile and contagious energy. She brought gourmet coffee for the entire board team, told jokes about the weekend, asked about everyone's family. They were consummate actors, Thomas realized. 8 years pretending to be upright executives while hiding secrets that included murder. Sarah arrived at 9 o'clock, discreet as always. She assumed her position as an invisible assistant, organized Thomas's schedule, prepared the materials for the day's meetings, but now there was a subtle difference in the way she moved around the office. A redoubled attention, as if she were cataloguing every detail, every conversation, every suspicious movement. During lunch, Thomas left the office under the pretext of an external meeting. In reality, he went to deliver the 3 copies of the documents. First to his lawyer, Dr. Martin Sullivan, a serious and competent man who didn't ask questions, just stored the envelope in a safe and signed a receipt. Then to Caroline Weber, an investigative journalist for the Boston Globe, whose eyes shone when Thomas mentioned corporate corruption and possible homicide. Finally, to FBI agent Robert Nichols, an upright man whom Thomas knew from social events. "If anything happens to me in the next few months," he said to each of them, "open this envelope and do what you think is right." When he returned to the office at 3 in the afternoon, Thomas felt like a man who had just signed his own death sentence. But he also felt a strange lightness, as if a weight he had carried for years had finally been shared. "How did it go?" asked Sarah when they met in the elevator, returning from different meetings. "Done," he said quietly. "Now we wait. Now we wait." But they didn't have to wait long. On Thursday, Alexander called Thomas for a private meeting. It was unusual. Normally, conversations between them happened in larger meetings or by email. "Thomas, I need to talk to you about a delicate matter," said Alexander, closing the door of the meeting room. "Of course, what is it about?" Alexander sat at the meeting table, but didn't relax. There was tension in his posture, a seriousness that Thomas rarely saw. "It has come to my attention some rumors about you asking questions about old events at the company." Thomas's heart accelerated, but he kept his expression neutral. "What kind of questions?" "About the Ethan Bennett case, about old documents, about internal investigations." There was something dangerous in Alexander's tone now, a veiled threat that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. "I don't know what you're talking about, Alexander." "No?" Alexander smiled, but it was a cold smile. "Then why did you request access to the 2017 archives last week? Why did you ask the IT staff to recover old emails? Why have you been talking to people who worked at the company at that time?" Thomas felt his blood freeze. He had been discovered. Somehow Alexander had noticed his investigation. "I'm preparing a presentation on the evolution of the company," he lied, "thinking about a marketing campaign that would show our growth trajectory." Alexander laughed, but it was a laugh without humor. "Thomas, we've worked together for 15 years. I know you, and I know when you're lying." The silence that followed was tense, loaded with danger. Thomas felt he was facing a snake about to strike. "What do you want, Alexander?" "I want you to stop. I want you to forget the past and focus on the future. Ethan Bennett has been dead for 8 years. There's nothing you can do to bring him back. And if I don't stop?" Alexander leaned forward, and now there was something genuinely threatening in his gaze. "Then you might find out that accidents happen more frequently than we imagine." The threat was clear, direct, undeniable. Thomas felt that he was facing the real Alexander Moore, the man who had orchestrated Ethan's destruction and probably ordered his death. "I understand," he said, keeping his voice firm. "I hope you really do understand." Alexander stood up. "Oh, and Thomas?" "That new assistant, Sarah. She asked some interesting questions to people from different departments. You should guide her better on the limits of professional curiosity." Thomas's blood turned to ice in his veins. They knew about Sarah. They knew she was investigating. "I'll talk to her." "Do that. For everyone's good." Alexander left the room, leaving Thomas alone with the terrible understanding that the game had changed. They were no longer the hunters. Now they were the prey. He needed to warn Sarah. He needed to ensure she was safe. He needed... His cell phone vibrated. A text message from an unknown number. "Your girlfriend is very beautiful. It would be a shame if something happened to her on the way home tonight." Thomas felt the world spin around him. They had Sarah, or they were about to have her. He ran to her desk, but the place was empty. Her purse had disappeared, the computer was turned off. A department colleague told him that Sarah had left at 5:30, saying she wasn't feeling well. Thomas called her cell phone. Voicemail. He called the landline at her apartment. No one answered. It was 6:40 on a Thursday evening in Boston. The traffic was impossible, but Thomas drove like a madman towards Cambridge, running red lights, cutting off cars, being honked at by irritated drivers. He arrived at Sarah's building in 40 minutes that seemed like an eternity. He ran up the stairs 3 steps at a time, his heart beating so hard he could hear it in his own ears. He knocked on the door of apartment 504. Silence. He knocked harder. Sarah, Sarah, are you there? Nothing. He was about to break down the door when he heard a noise inside, footsteps, the lock being opened. The door opened and there she was, alive, whole, with a look of surprise on her face. Thomas. What? He pulled her inside the apartment and closed the door behind him, locking all the locks. They know, he said, breathless. Alexander knows. They know about our investigation, about you, about everything. Sarah's face paled. How? I don't know, but he threatened me directly. And then I received a message. He showed her the cell phone. Sarah read the message and went even paler. I need to leave Boston, she said immediately. Today, now. To where? It doesn't matter, far away, until we can expose everything. Thomas looked at her, disheveled hair, face pale with fear, but still determined, still strong, and knew he couldn't let her face this alone. Let's go together, he said. Thomas, you don't understand. If we both disappear at the same time, I understand perfectly, but I'm not going to let you face murderers alone. Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if she were measuring the sincerity of his words. Are you sure? Because from the moment we leave here together, there's no turning back. We'll be on the run. We'll be at war. Thomas thought about everything he had to lose. The company, the career, the comfortable life, the respectability. Then he thought about Ethan Bennett, dead for money and ambition. He thought about Sarah, alone against killers. He thought about the man he wanted to be versus the man he had been. I'm sure. She nodded and began throwing clothes into a travel bag. Where are we going? Asked Thomas. To the only person I completely trust. My Aunt Rose. She lives on a farm in Virginia near Charlottesville. Isolated place, safe. And from there we plan our next move. And we ensure that Alexander and Victoria pay for what they did, even if it costs us everything. 20 minutes later, they were on the road, driving towards Virginia, in a black Honda Civic that Thomas had rented with fake documents that Sarah had obtained in a way he preferred not to ask about. As Boston disappeared in the rearview mirror, Thomas realized that he was leaving behind not just a city, but an entire life. There was no turning back. There was no middle ground. Now they were just 2 fugitives in love, carrying evidence that could destroy powerful murderers, driving through the American night towards an uncertain but finally honest future. And for the first time in 8 years, Thomas felt completely alive. Chapter 5. The road to Charlottesville wound through the Virginia mountains like a sleeping snake, cutting through landscapes that seemed hand-painted by some artist in love with the American land. It was 4 in the morning when Thomas and Sarah finally spotted the first lights of the historic city, but they weren't going to stop there. Aunt Rose's farm was 20 more kilometers ahead, on a dirt road that led to the heart of the valley. Thomas had been driving for almost 8 hours, stopping only to refuel and switch drivers with Sarah. Now it was she who was driving the Civic along the bumpy road, while he observed the landscape that was revealed with the first rays of the sun. There was something deeply American in that view. Hills covered with deciduous forest, colonial houses scattered across the valley. The intense green that only the Virginia mountains knew how to produce. We're almost there, said Sarah, her voice carrying an emotion that he couldn't interpret. Relief, longing, fear of what they would find. The farm appeared after a sharp curve, a 2-story colonial house, painted white with blue details, surrounded by a garden that seemed to have grown organically over decades. There was a spacious veranda with rocking chairs, an orchard that perfumed the morning air, and a tranquility that contrasted brutally with the tension of the last few days. This is it, said Sarah, parking the car in the shade of a century-old apple tree. A woman came out of the house before they even got out of the car. Rose Bennett was about 60, grey hair tied in a loose bun, simple floral dress, and a smile that lit up her entire face. It was possible to see the resemblance to Sarah in the brown eyes and the shape of the face, but there was a serenity in her that her niece was still searching for. "My girl," said Rose, hugging Sarah tightly. "When you called in the middle of the night, I almost had a heart attack. I thought something terrible had happened." "It did, Aunt Rose. But now we're safe." Rose looked at Thomas with curiosity, but without judgment. There was a wisdom in her eyes that suggested she had seen a lot in life. "And this is the man who is head over heels because of my niece." Thomas felt his face heat up. It was impressive how some people managed to read complex situations with disconcerting simplicity. "I'm Thomas Miller, Mrs. Rose. Thank you for receiving us." "Mrs. Rose, no, just Rose. And anyone who makes my Sarah smile like that is welcome here." She paused, studying him carefully. "Although I have the impression that you're not here just for romance." Sarah and Thomas exchanged glances. How much should they tell? How much did Rose need to know to understand the danger that had possibly arrived at her home? "It's a long story, Aunt." "Then let's go inside. Coffee's been on the stove for 2 hours waiting for you." And long stories are better told at a full table. The farm's kitchen was the heart of the house, a wood stove that warmed the environment, a solid wood table marked by decades of use, iron pans that seemed to have fed entire generations. Rose served strong black coffee, still warm cheese bread, homemade blackberry jam, fresh eggs that she herself had collected from the hen house. "Now," she said, sitting at the table with them, "tell me what's happening and don't omit anything. At 60, a person has seen everything and is no longer surprised by almost anything." Sarah started from the beginning, the death of the parents, the guardianship assumed by Ethan, his work at the technology company, the discovery of the betrayal, the suspicious death. Rose listened in silence, only asking occasional questions to clarify details. When Sarah got to the part about her entry into Tech Vision in search of answers, Rose looked at Thomas with renewed interest. "So you were one of the men who betrayed my nephew?" It wasn't a question. It was a statement, but without judgment in her voice. Thomas nodded, prepared for rejection, for anger, for expulsion from the house. "I was, and I hate myself for it every day for 8 years. Self-hatred doesn't bring anyone back, boy." "No, but sometimes it motivates doing what's right." Rose smiled, and it was a smile that carried decades of wisdom about human nature. "And that's why you're here, to do what's right." Thomas told his part of the story, the silent investigation, the evidence collected, the discovery of the documents hidden by Ethan, Alexander's threat, the escape. Rose listened to everything carefully, making mental notes, processing information like someone who was used to solving complex problems. "So you have enough evidence to send these men to jail," she said when they finished. "We do, but we also have killers after us," responded Sarah. "And you think you're safe here?" The question was asked in a casual tone, but there was real concern behind it. "For now," said Thomas. "They don't know about you, ma'am. They don't know about this farm. But eventually they'll find out." Rose nodded. "Then we have to act quickly." "We?" asked Sarah. "Girl, do you think I'm going to let killers run loose knowing they killed my nephew? That I'm going to stand by while you risk your life to do justice?" Rose stood up from the table. "I'm going to help. And I know people who can help too." In the hours that followed, Rose showed herself to be much more than a retired farmer. She had been an investigative journalist in Richmond for 30 years, specialized in political and corporate corruption. She knew officers, prosecutors, journalists, lawyers. She had a network of contacts that could be precious for exposing Alexander and Victoria. "The first step," she said, organizing the documents on the kitchen table, "is to ensure that this evidence reaches several authorities simultaneously. We can't risk someone trying to cover up the case." "I've already delivered copies to 3 people in Boston," said Thomas. "Good, but we need more. I need to contact Helen Carter, a federal prosecutor I've known for 20 years, and William Johnson from the Department of Justice, and at least 2 journalists who aren't afraid to confront powerful people." Sarah watched her aunt with admiration. It was as if Rose had awakened a part of herself that had been dormant for years. "Aunt, this is dangerous. If they find out you're helping us." "My child, dangerous was having spent 8 years knowing they killed Ethan and not having done anything. Dangerous is letting killers loose, because we're afraid." Rose took Sarah's hands in hers. "Your brother was special. He was brilliant, generous, brave. He deserves justice. And you deserve to be able to live in peace." The rest of the day passed in a strange mixture of strategic planning and rural tranquility. Rose made discreet calls to her contacts. Sarah and Thomas organized the evidence into even more complete dossiers, and everyone tried to stay calm despite the underlying tension. In the afternoon, Rose suggested they rest a bit. "So you drove all night. Haven't slept in 2 days. You need a few hours of sleep to think clearly." She showed them a room on the upper floor, simple, clean, with a double bed covered by a patchwork quilt that seemed to have been handmade. There was something deeply welcoming about that space, a sense of security that neither of them had felt in days. "Here it is," said Rose. "Rest, dinner at 7. And don't worry, no one will find you here." When Rose closed the door, Sarah and Thomas were alone for the first time since the library at the lodge. There was a different tension in the air now. No longer fear or immediate danger, but the awareness that they were finally alone, away from threats, free to be just two people who loved each other. "I can't believe we're here," said Sarah, sitting on the edge of the bed. "Neither can I." Thomas approached her, but stopped a few steps away. "Sarah, I need to ask you something." "What?" "Do you regret it? Having told me the truth, having decided to fight with me instead of destroying me?" Sarah looked at him with an expression that mixed tenderness and a fierce determination. "Thomas, 2 weeks ago I would have done anything to see you destroyed. Today I would do anything to protect you. I don't regret it. It scares me, but I don't regret it." He moved closer, sat next to her on the bed. "And I never imagined I could love someone the way I love you. I never imagined that someone could know me completely, including my most terrible mistakes, and still choose to stay with me. That's what love is, isn't it? Knowing all of someone's shadows and still choosing the light." They kissed then, but it was different from the previous kisses. There was no urgency of those who might be interrupted at any moment. There was no weight of unrevealed secrets. It was the kiss of two people who were finally free to love without reservations. Thomas's hands got lost in Sarah's hair, feeling the silky texture he had dreamed of touching. She brought her hands to his face, tracing the lines that the last days of tension had deepened. "Thomas," she whispered against his lips. "Yes, I love you completely, without reservations. I love you too, more than I thought it was possible to love someone." They lay down on the bed, still dressed, just embracing, feeling the sensation of finally being safe in each other's arms. Thomas buried his face in Sarah's hair, inhaling the perfume that had become his definition of home. "When all this is over," he said softly, "what do you want to do?" "I don't know. I never thought beyond revenge. I never imagined there could be an after. And now," Sarah turned to look him in the eyes, "now I want to discover who I am when I'm not carrying anger. I want to discover who we are when we're not running or fighting. I want—" "What?" "I want to wake up every day by your side and discover what kind of life we can build together." They fell asleep like that, intertwined, exhausted, but finally at peace. For a few hours, the outside world ceased to exist. There were no killers, no evidence, no danger. There were just the two of them, finally free to love without fear. Thomas woke to the sound of voices on the floor below. It was almost 6 in the evening. The sun was already low in the sky, and he could hear Rose talking to someone in the kitchen. Sarah was still asleep, curved against his chest, breathing softly. He got up carefully so as not to wake her and approached the window. Down below he could see Rose talking to an older man, with white hair and military posture. There was something familiar about him, but Thomas couldn't identify what. 5 minutes later, Sarah woke up. "What is it?" she asked, noticing his tension. "Rose is talking to someone downstairs, a man I don't know." Sarah got up and looked through the window. "It's Colonel James, family friend. He was with the FBI before retiring. Do you think Rose told him?" "Probably. She said she knew people who could help." They went down to the kitchen. Rose was serving coffee to Colonel James, a man in his 70s who radiated authority even in retirement. "You woke up. Colonel, these are Sarah and Thomas. Kids, this is James Wilson, an old friend who's going to help us." The colonel stood up and greeted them both firmly. "Rose told me everything. Delicate situation, but not impossible to resolve. Do you think we can safely expose Alexander and Victoria?" asked Thomas. I think you have no choice. Men like these don't stop. If they're not neutralized now, they'll continue killing anyone who represents a threat. The coldness with which he said this sent a chill down Sarah's spine. What's the plan? She asked. Simultaneous exposure on multiple fronts. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. The evidence arrives simultaneously at the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS, and 3 different media outlets. They're impossible to cover up. And our safety. You stay here until the arrest warrants are issued. With luck, by tomorrow afternoon, Alexander Moore and Victoria Sanders will be in handcuffs. It seemed like a solid plan, but Thomas felt an uneasiness he couldn't explain. Colonel, how can we be sure they won't discover where we are before that? We can't, but we have some advantages. This farm is in the name of a shell company that Rose created years ago to protect assets. There's no way to trace it back to you, and besides, he was interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the dirt road. Everyone turned to the window. It was a black SUV with tinted windows coming up the road towards the farm. Was anyone expecting visitors? Asked the colonel with a calmness that contrasted with the tension that took hold of everyone else. No, said Rose, her voice laden with concern. Thomas felt his blood freeze. Somehow, Alexander had discovered where they were. Exit? He asked quickly. Back door leads to the orchard, said Rose. From there you can reach the woods without being seen. No, said the colonel firmly. If you run now, you'll spend the rest of your life running. It's time to confront. Colonel, they're killers, and I'm an ex-FBI agent with 40 years of experience dealing with criminals. He pulled a pistol from under his jacket. Rose, take them to the room upstairs. Lock the door. Don't come out until I give the signal. And you? I'm going to receive our visitors. The SUV stopped in front of the house. Thomas saw 2 men get out of the vehicle. They weren't Alexander or Victoria, but men he didn't know. They had the appearance of professionals. Dark suits, military posture, coordinated movements. Let's go, whispered Rose, leading Sarah and Thomas upstairs. From the room they could hear voices downstairs. The colonel's calm voice answering questions they couldn't discern. Then a harsher voice with a New York accent making demands. We know they're here. Make it easy for all of us. I don't know what you're talking about, replied the colonel. Sir, don't make this more difficult than it needs to be. Sarah held Thomas's hand tightly. They were cornered, and the colonel was down there alone against at least 2 armed men. Thomas, whispered Sarah. Yes? If anything happens to me, nothing's going to happen. If it does, do you promise you'll expose everything? That you'll ensure Ethan gets justice? I promise, but it won't come to that. A shot echoed downstairs, then another, then silence. Rose was pale, Sarah was trembling. Thomas felt like his heart was going to explode in his chest. Footsteps on the stairs, someone coming up. The bedroom door opened and the colonel appeared, the pistol still in his hand, but with no visible injuries. It's over, he said simply. The men, they're alive. Wounded, but alive. I've already called for FBI reinforcements. They'll be here in 20 minutes. How? Experience, my child, and the fact that they didn't expect resistance. Rose collapsed into a chair, relieved. Sarah and Thomas embraced, trembling with the adrenaline discharge. Does this mean it's over? Asked Sarah. It means that Alexander and Victoria got desperate enough to send killers after you, which means they know they're doomed. The colonel put away his gun. And it means that tomorrow morning, when the evidence reaches the authorities, there will be no more obstacles to their arrest. 2 hours later, the farm was full of FBI agents. The 2 men who had come after them were handcuffed in an ambulance, being taken to a hospital in custody. The colonel was giving testimony. Rose was serving coffee to all the officers, and Sarah and Thomas finally understood that the escape phase was over. And now? Asked Sarah. Now you're going to Washington, to a safe location, until Alexander and Victoria are arrested, said the agent in charge. Then you'll give a formal testimony. And then we're free? Then you're free. That night, while the federal agents stood guard at the farm, Sarah and Thomas walked through the orchard. The moon was full, silvering the leaves of the fruit trees, creating romantic shadows on the ground. When all this began, said Sarah, I wanted to destroy your life. And you succeeded. Destroyed it completely. She looked at him, worried. But you built a new life in its place, a life that's much more worthwhile. They stopped under a century-old apple tree. Thomas took Sarah's hands in his. Sarah Bennett. When this whole madness is over, when Alexander and Victoria are in prison, when we can live without looking over our shoulder. Do you want to build a life with me? Thomas Miller, it's the only thing I want. They kissed there under the apple tree, with federal agents patrolling around the property, knowing that in a few hours all the truth would be revealed, and they could finally begin to live the love that was born amid the chaos. On the horizon, the lights of Charlottesville shone like a promise that dawn would bring justice. And with justice, freedom. And with freedom, the chance to discover what kind of love could flourish when it no longer needed to hide in the shadows. The storm was almost at an end. Now all that was missing was the rainbow. Chapter 6. Dawn came to the Virginia farm with a golden clarity that seemed prophetic. It was 6 in the morning on a Friday that would go down in history as the day when the truth finally came to light. Thomas woke to the sound of helicopters flying over the property. No longer a threat, but protection from the FBI. Sarah had been awake for an hour, sitting on the veranda, observing the coordinated movement of the federal agents who had transformed the quiet farm into an operations center. There were discrete vehicles positioned on the road, communications agents setting up equipment, officers coordinating simultaneous actions that would happen in Boston, New York, and Washington. "Nervous?" asked Thomas, sitting next to her in the rocking chair. "Terrified," admitted Sarah. "For 2 years I dreamed of this moment. Now that it's here, I'm afraid something will go wrong." "It won't go wrong. We have too much evidence, too many witnesses, too many authorities involved." Colonel James approached them carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee and a satisfied expression. "I just spoke with Washington," he said, handing them the coffee. "At 9 o'clock sharp, arrest warrants will be executed simultaneously in 5 states. Alexander Moore will be arrested at the Tech Vision office. Victoria Sanders will be arrested at home in Manhattan. And 8 more people involved in the corruption network will be detained at the same time." "8 people?" asked Thomas, surprised. "The investigation revealed that the scheme was bigger than we imagined. They had contacts in other companies, in government agencies, even in offshore banks. Your brother," he said, looking at Sarah, "discovered just the tip of the iceberg." Sarah closed her eyes, processing the information. Ethan had died for discovering something even bigger than she had imagined. His death had been necessary to protect an entire network of corruption that moved millions of dollars. "And the press?" asked Thomas. "At 9:30, 3 newspapers, 2 magazines, and 2 television channels will simultaneously receive complete dossiers with all the evidence. Impossible to cover up. By the afternoon, it will be on every news outlet in the country." Rose appeared on the veranda, carrying a tray with warm scones. "Kids, eat something. It's going to be a long day." But neither of them had an appetite. There was a tension in the air that made it impossible to think about food. It was like being on the eve of a battle that would define the rest of their lives. At 8:45, the colonel's phone rang. "Hello?" "Yes, I understand. Perfect. Keep me informed." He hung up and looked at Sarah and Thomas with a tense smile. "Alexander Moore just arrived at the office. Victoria Sanders has been monitored at home since 6 this morning. Operation is ready." "Can I watch?" asked Sarah. "What do you mean?" "Their arrest. I want to see." The colonel hesitated. "Sarah, I don't know if that's a good idea. It might be traumatic." "Colonel, I spent 8 years dreaming of this moment. I need to see it with my own eyes." Thomas took her hand. "Are you sure?" "Absolutely." 15 minutes later, they were in an FBI van, equipped with monitors that showed live images from different points of the operations. They could see the Tech Vision building, where federal agents were discreetly positioned. They could see Victoria's house in New York, surrounded by an elite team. 9 o'clock sharp. "Operation initiated," said the voice on the radio. On the screen, showing the Tech Vision office, they saw Alexander Moore in his office talking on the phone, completely oblivious to what was about to happen. He was elegant as always, impeccable gray suit, blue tie, posture of a successful man who controlled his own destiny. Then the door to his office opened, and 4 federal agents entered. Even without audio, it was possible to see the shock on Alexander's face. The way he dropped the phone, how he abruptly stood up from his chair, how he tried to assume a posture of indignation. One of the agents showed the arrest warrant. Another approached Alexander with handcuffs. "Alexander Moore, you are under arrest for racketeering, active and passive corruption, money laundering and homicide," said the officer's voice through the radio. Sarah held Thomas's hand so tightly that he felt her nails digging into his skin. But he didn't mind. He understood the intensity of the moment for her. On the second screen, Victoria Sanders was being woken up by agents who had invaded her penthouse in Manhattan. Even in pajamas, without makeup, she tried to maintain her composure. But when she saw the handcuffs, her mask of control finally fell. "Victoria Sanders, you are under arrest for the same crimes as Alexander Moore, plus document forgery and obstruction of justice." "This is a mistake," shouted Victoria. "You don't know who you're messing with." "We know exactly," replied the officer. "We're messing with murderers." Sarah began to cry. They weren't tears of sadness, but of relief. 8 years of pain, anger, and uncertainty were finally coming to an end. Those responsible for Ethan's death were being arrested, handcuffed, taken away like the criminals they always were. "It's over," whispered Thomas. "It's really over." "No," said Sarah, wiping away the tears. "Now it begins." At 10 in the morning, they were back at the farm, watching the first news reports. The scandal was already dominating all news channels. Breaking news that 8 executives of technology companies were arrested today in an FBI operation investigating corporate corruption and homicide, said the CNN anchor. Among those arrested are Alexander Moore, Vice President of TechVision, and Victoria Sanders, Financial Director of the same company. The report continued with details of the investigation, mentions of the documents found, the evidence of commissioned murder. And then the part that made Sarah cry again. The investigation revealed that Ethan Bennett, inventor and entrepreneur who died in 2017 in a supposed car accident, was actually the victim of a homicide commissioned by the executives arrested today. Bennett had discovered a corruption scheme and was about to report it when he was murdered. For the first time in 8 years, Ethan's name was being mentioned publicly, not as an unstable drunk who died in an accident, but as a victim, as a hero who died trying to do what was right. "Your brother has been avenged," said Rose, hugging Sarah. "And more importantly, his name has been cleared." In the hours that followed, the farm's phone didn't stop ringing. Journalists wanted interviews with Sarah, the victim's sister. Lawyers offered services. Human rights activists wanted support. The whole world, it seemed, wanted to talk to them. But Sarah and Thomas decided it wasn't yet time to speak publicly. First, they needed to give formal testimony. Then they needed to begin to process everything that had happened. And mainly, they needed to decide what the rest of their lives would be like. "I'm going to resign as CEO," said Thomas that afternoon as they walked through the orchard. "Why? How can I continue running a company that was built on your brother's blood?" Sarah stopped walking and turned to him. "Thomas, you didn't build anything on anyone's blood. You were deceived, manipulated, used. But in the last 5 years, you tried to do what was right. And now you have the chance to rebuild the company in an honest way. You think I should continue? I think you should do what your heart tells you. But remember, giving up is easy, fixing is hard." They resumed walking in silence, reflecting on the future. TechVision was in crisis. With the arrest of Alexander and Victoria, with the scandal dominating the news, the company would lose clients, investors, credibility. It would take a lot of work to rebuild. "What if we stayed?" asked Thomas suddenly. "What do you mean?" "What if I continued as CEO, but you became my partner? What if we rebuilt the company together, ethically, honestly? What if we made it what Ethan dreamed it would be?" Sarah stopped again, processing the idea. "A company that supports independent inventors, that invests in small startups, that chooses to do what's right instead of what's profitable?" "Exactly. And what if we created a fund in Ethan's name? To support young inventors who need opportunities? The Ethan Bennett Fund for Ethical Innovation. I like the name." They kissed there under the fruit trees, sealing not just their love, but also a partnership that could transform the company that had cost Ethan's life into a force for good. A week later, they were back in Boston. The city seemed the same, but they were completely different people. Thomas's apartment in Beacon Hill still had the panoramic view, but now there were photos of Sarah on the tables, her clothes in the closet, a feminine presence that transformed the cold environment into a true home. TechVision was in tatters. 3 important clients had cancelled contracts. 2 investors had withdrawn funding. The press monitored every move of the company, but Thomas and Sarah worked 16 hours a day to rebuild. Emergency meeting with the employees, said Sarah, entering Thomas's office with a stack of reports. How are they reacting? Half are scared about the possibility of layoffs. Half are outraged about having worked for criminals without knowing. And the other half are curious to know how we're going to rebuild. Interesting math, Sarah smiled. That's what happens when you do an opinion survey in a company in crisis. People get confused. The meeting with the employees took place in the main auditorium. Thomas went up on stage alone, facing 200 pairs of eyes that mixed fear, anger, curiosity, and expectation. I know you all have questions, he began. I know you're worried about your jobs, about the future of the company, about how we're going to overcome this crisis. Absolute silence. First, I want you to know that no one will be fired because of this situation. The only ones responsible for the crimes committed were Alexander Moore and Victoria Sanders. You are victims as much as anyone else. Murmurs of relief throughout the auditorium. Second, I want to introduce you to my new partner. Sarah Bennett will assume the Vice Presidency of Ethical Innovation. Together we're going to rebuild this company based on values that we should never have abandoned. Sarah went up on stage, and Thomas saw several people whispering, recognizing the surname. Ethan Bennett was my brother, said Sarah, her voice echoing through the auditorium. He died because he discovered that people from this company were betraying the values that you believed you were defending. Today, we have the chance to build the company that he dreamed this would be. What followed was a question and answer session that lasted 3 hours. Employees wanted to know about changes, about the financial situation, about the new values of the company. But mainly, they wanted to know if they could trust the new leadership. One last question, said an employee from the IT department. How do we know that you're different? How do we know that you won't repeat the mistakes of the past? Thomas and Sarah looked at each other. Because, said Thomas, our story began with lies, betrayal, and death. And even so, we chose to build something true from those ruins. If we manage to transform a personal tragedy into a force for good, we can do the same with this company. 3 months later, TechVision had transformed into a completely different company. The Ethan Bennett Fund for Ethical Innovation had already approved investments in 12 startups run by young inventors. The company had adopted radical transparency policies, including monthly reports on all important decisions. And for the first time in history, employees elected representatives to the board of directors. The numbers still aren't good, said Sarah, reviewing financial reports in the office she now shared with Thomas. But are they improving? Slowly. We lost old clients, but we're gaining new ones. People who want to do business with an ethical company. And personally, how are you? Sarah smiled, that smile that now illuminated Thomas's days. Personally, I've never been better. I wake up every day beside the man I love, working to build my brother's dream. It's more than I could have imagined, even knowing that I was part of the problem, especially knowing that, because it means that people can change, that mistakes can be corrected, that true love is possible even in the most unlikely circumstances. That night they had dinner at a simple restaurant in Cambridge, the same neighborhood where Sarah lived when it all began. They were no longer CEO and invisible assistant. They were partners, a couple, two people who had chosen to build a life together from the ashes of a tragedy. Sarah, said Thomas, taking a small velvet case from his pocket. Thomas, what? It's not what you're thinking. Or rather it is and it isn't. He opened the case, revealing not an engagement ring, but a necklace with a pendant in the shape of a book. It's beautiful, said Sarah, touching the pendant. But why a book? Because our story began in a library, because we found the truth hidden among old books, and because I want you to have something that symbolizes that our story is being written every day. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. Thomas. And also, he said, pulling out another case, smaller, because I want our story to have a happy ending. This time it was a ring, simple, elegant, with a diamond that captured the light of the restaurant and transformed it into tiny rainbows. Sarah Bennett, will you marry me? The entire restaurant seemed to fall silent. Sarah looked at the ring, then at the man who had once helped destroy her brother's life, and who was now offering her a future built on true love and genuine redemption. Yes, she said, extending her hand for him to place the ring. Yes, I want to marry you. The restaurant exploded in applause. Strangers stood up to congratulate them. The waiter brought champagne on the house, and Thomas and Sarah kissed like two people who finally understood that some love stories are so powerful that they managed to transform tragedy into triumph. 6 months later, they married in a simple ceremony at Rose's farm. Colonel James walked Sarah down the improvised altar in the garden. Rose cried throughout the ceremony. And when the justice of the peace asked if there was anyone who opposed that union, everyone laughed because the only person who might have objections, Ethan, would probably be applauding from heaven. During the celebration, Thomas gave a speech that made everyone cry. 2 years ago, he said, looking at Sarah, I was a man who lived carrying guilt. Today I am a man who lives carrying hope. 2 years ago, Sarah was a woman who lived carrying anger. Today she is a woman who lives carrying love. He paused, looking at the starry sky. Ethan, I know you're listening to us. Thank you for having such an extraordinary sister. Thank you for leaving us clues to find the truth. And thank you for teaching us that some battles are worth fighting even when the price is high. On the first anniversary of Ethan's death after the trials, Thomas and Sarah visited the cemetery where he was buried. They brought fresh flowers and a new plaque for the tomb, which now identified Ethan not as an anonymous victim, but as inventor, visionary, hero. He died fighting for the truth. He would be proud, said Sarah, arranging the flowers. Of what? Of us, of the company, of the fund we created, of how we transformed his pain into hope for other people. Do you think he would approve of our marriage? Sarah smiled, that smile that was now the center of Thomas's universe. I think he would laugh and say, only my sister would fall in love with the guy who screwed me over and still make it into an epic love story. They laughed, and it was a laugh full of longing, but also of peace. Alexander and Victoria had been sentenced to 16 years in prison. The corruption network had been dismantled. TechVision was thriving as an ethical company, and they had built a life together that was proof that true love can flourish even in the most unlikely soil. 2 years later, on a December morning, Sarah woke up feeling nauseous. 3 pharmacy tests and a medical consultation confirmed she was pregnant. A baby, said Thomas, still processing the news. A baby, confirmed Sarah. Ethan would be an uncle, and you're going to be a father. They embraced in the kitchen of the apartment they now shared, crying tears of pure joy. There was something deeply symbolic in the fact that a new life was coming to a family that had been born from the ruins of a tragedy. What are we going to name him? Asked Thomas. If it's a boy, Ethan, no discussion. And if it's a girl, Rose. In honor of the woman who saved us. Rose Bennett Miller. Rose Bennett Miller. The baby was born on a sunny August morning, exactly 3 years after the arrest of Alexander and Victoria. It was a girl, with her mother's brown eyes and her father's serene smile. Rose Bennett Miller came into the world in a family that had learned that true love is capable of transforming anything. That justice, no matter how late it arrives, always comes, and that some love stories are so powerful that they manage to rewrite the past and create a better future. In the maternity ward, holding his daughter in his arms, Thomas looked at Sarah and said, "Thank you." For what? For having hated me so much that you were forced to truly know me, for having loved me so much that you transformed me into the man I should have been all along. Thank you, replied Sarah, for being brave enough to change, for showing me that some people deserve forgiveness, for teaching me that revenge is good, but love is better. They kissed their daughter's forehead, who slept peacefully, unaware of the fact that she had been born at the center of a love story that had begun with betrayal and ended with redemption. Outside, Boston continued to be Boston, noisy, chaotic, full of stories that crossed at every corner. But inside that hospital room, there was a family that proved that some stories have true happy endings. Stories where love conquers hate, where truth conquers lies, where two people can meet in the most unlikely circumstances and build something beautiful from the ruins of something terrible. And as Rose Bennett Miller slept in her parents' arms, the sun set over the city, painting the sky with colors that seemed to celebrate the fact that sometimes, just sometimes, justice and love arrive exactly when we need them most. It was the end of a story, and the beginning of many others.